Amit, are you going to have your camera on?
Not that good looking, yes.
Of course, you have the camera on, Worthy. Yeah.
We can start.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Dietrich, the Senior Associate Vice President for University Advancement. And okay, I think the recording just started, so let me start over again. My name is Bob Dietrich. I'm the Senior Associate Vice President for University Advancement at Northeastern. And on behalf of President Ayoun and all of us here at Northeastern, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. At a time when it's difficult, if not impossible, to physically be together, these types of events, these virtual events have become our new normal, but they've also become vital to our ability to stay connected as a university with our alumni, our parents, our friends all over the world. So I'm thrilled to be part of this evening's event. And normally I would plan a trip around an event like this. And as I've done before, traveling with the Damore McKim School of Business Dean Rajan Chhabadi, more recently with President Ayoun for the Global Leadership Summit that was held in Mumbai in late February. Just before the pandemic started sweeping the globe. So here in Boston, it's a bright, sunny, brisk fall day where we resumed classes just a week ago at the university. And certainly the campus has a different look and feel to it, but there's a certain energy as there is every fall when the students come back. And while it is difficult to see people's smiles behind a face mask, you can see the energy in their eyes and their excitement to be back at the university. For folks like me, we are on a staggered work schedule. So we come in to de-densify the office space. We come in every 2 to 3 days a week. And we start our day with a visit to the test center, which is in the Cabot Cage on campus. And we have today, we'll mark a milestone since we began testing in late August. Today we will have tested and administered over 100,000 COVID tests on campus to faculty, students, and staff. I'm pleased to report that our positive rate is 0.05%, which represents just over 50 individuals, most of whom are students. But I'm also pleased to report that of those 47 students, 16 are fully recovered, and the other are in isolation and wellness suites and wellness residence halls on the campus. So I want to assure everybody that in the reopening of the campus, that there was one guiding principle. It was very simple. We had to keep the safety and the health of our students, faculty, and staff at the forefront. So that's essentially what we've been doing. The testing center is able to test anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 students, faculty, and staff a day. And return the results within 24 to 36 hours. And that's largely because we were able to establish our own testing center up in the Burlington campus, which is just outside of Boston, our innovation campus. So that is that's a quick update on what's happening and how the university is responding to the pandemic. In the classroom, students are given the opportunity to either study remotely in synchronization with those students that are in class, physically in class together. We can't accommodate all of them because we have to de-densify and keep social distance and masking and that sort of thing. But it's the platform is called NU Flex. And I would invite all of you to visit the Northeastern website where NU Flex, our testing protocols, everything, and our response to the current pandemic is front and center on the website. So I'd encourage you to visit that if you're interested in learning more. I would also like to say that our faculty and our scientists have been busy researching ever since and pivoting their research around the pandemic, whether it's the psychological, the social, the economic impact, whether it's vaccine development, whether it's rapid testing techniques, all of these things. And one of the most important roles that we're playing on the global scene is through the Network Science Institute, which is mapping the spread of the virus globally. And just as importantly, is not only helping to mitigate the situation and help inform public policy in the current situation, but it's also looking forward to look at ways to prevent future pandemics. So with that, I'd like to recognize the alumni leadership on the ground. Without your leadership, Samir, Vidhai, others are with us, we couldn't possibly have launched Mumbai community, hosted the Global Leadership Summit, or hosted events like this. So I commend you for the initiative that you've taken to put together this program. It's a very interesting and very timely topic that we're going to talk about this evening. And I just want to thank you all for the role that you're playing. I'd also like to recognize one of our students, Vidhai Bhaiya, who has been in India this past semester, this spring, and has interviewed and talked to over 250 alumni and parents, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And what he's learned from that process will help inform our strategy for moving forward in India. So I'm going to thank him. He's going to be returning to India, and I know he's eager to be part of the leadership team on the ground in India. So he graduates in December this year. So he will be back and will continue his work that he started this past spring. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Vidhai to make a few more introductions. Vidhai?
Yes, thank you, Bob. And thank you everyone for tuning into our session today on how to sustain mental and physical health in stressful times. We're certain you will have many takeaways from the session today as we continue to work through these unprecedented times. Before we begin, I want to take a quick minute to introduce, introduce to you our Northeastern alumni leadership community and our small team here. Our goal is to ensure our alumni network remains engaged with the university, whether they're still on campus or not. I'll begin with myself. I'm Vidhi Rajpal, and I make up 1/3 of our team here in Mumbai. I graduated from Northeastern's Damore McKim School of Business in 2015, with a degree in finance and entrepreneurship. Currently, I work at the Walt Disney Company, and we are very excited to be able to continue hosting events for all of our network here, and welcome once again to our session. I will quickly hand over to Pranav and Chirag, and they can introduce themselves too.
Sure. Thank you, Vidhi, and thank you, Bob. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Pranav Adnani, and I'm a proud Husky, a graduate of 2015 from Northeastern's Damore McKim School of Business. And I did a double major in management and marketing. And I work here in Mumbai. I have 2 startups. One's into digital advertising and one's into tech by the name of Mindfulness and Neighbors Technologies. And our objective here, again, like Vidhi mentioned, is to grow the Mumbai community and spread our footprint for Northeastern in India. So I'd hand it over to Chirag now to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Chirag Doshi. I did my MBA in 2001 from Northeastern and came back to India and have been working with Morgan Stanley ever since. So one school, one company, that's it. But would really like to thank the speakers for their time and all the viewers. I'm sure this should be very insightful. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Pranav and Chirag. So before we continue, like Bob mentioned, he would love to be here. And truth be told, we would love to have him and the entire faculty that we hosted back in February and March through the Global Summit. We would love to have everybody back here. But without further ado, I would like to now introduce to you all one of our fellow Huskies, Mr. Samir Savara, who has been integral in bringing together today's panel. Samir is based in Mumbai, and he graduated from Northeastern University's Business School with an MBA in 1995. He is currently the managing partner of Sarah Inc., and he's at the forefront of the electric revolution in transportation in India. He has over 15 years of experience in the power sector, more specifically in gas and thermal power. And he has partnered with pioneers and leaders in the electrical vehicle space, mapping the infrastructure to implement and grow the electric bus market here in India. Samir prides himself in understanding how to integrate both the technical and business demands of the industry. And he currently has 3 offices in Korea, China, France, and the UK and the US. If I'm wrong, Samir, please do correct me. But with that,
yeah.
great. So with that said, we're very excited to have Samir collaborating with the alumni leadership team. And Samir, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Vidhi. That was a big introduction. I just want to say that, I reconnected with Northeastern this year in January after 25 years, and it's been an amazing experience because I met the team and I was like, wow, this has really become a go-to university now. And when Vidhi approached me to say what would, if we could put together a program, I thought this would be an ideal situation to have Reenee, Amit, and of course then Susan added on was, just to get to know what people are going through. We all are going through something right now in this COVID times, but to be able to understand and, get to know what other people are going through, I thought it would be a good idea, and also help in combating this situation to the best of our ability. I got my friend Abha, who's a senior journalist, to moderate this session so that, it goes in a certain way and a flow. Over to you, Abha, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Samir. Excited to be here. It's wonderful to have such a great panel come together to discuss what really is a critical issue at this time. I just want to introduce our panelists, although I know most of you are aware, of who they are. Amit Malik, the founder and CEO of InnerHour, joining us. We have Reenee Singh, the CEO, Association of Family Therapy and Systemic Practices in the UK, and Susan Whitfield Gabrielli, Professor of Psychology and Director of Northeastern University Biomed Imaging Center. Great to have all of you with us because you also all share such deep perspective in your respective fields. And I'd be happy to, in fact, allow you to also share a little bit more about what you do as we begin. But let me start off with a few stats, especially since, we are going to discuss how this impacts families, relationships, life as people learn to deal with working from home, but also students naturally. And the latest stats suggest that there has been, at least here in India, an increase in anxiety by about 41% in students alone, 27% in feelings of hopelessness, 38% in loneliness, in boredom, and most of them missing that interpersonal connection and wanting to be back on ground and in campuses. So Amit, let me start off with you and get a sense from you on really how deeply, the issues surrounding mental health and lifestyle have really come to the fore during this time. You've been running InnerHour now for several years, but the kind of demand, for people admitting and also reaching out for these services has gone up exponentially in the last 6 months.
Thanks, Abha, and thanks to the university for having me here to talk about this important issue. So I'm a psychiatrist by background, and I have sort of been back in India from the UK for about 6 years, and really trying to understand and use technology to solve the mental health crisis in India. Now, the difficulty that we're experiencing right now is twofold, right? We've got a pandemic on a pandemic, if so to speak. And we've got a massive mental health crisis, at least in this ecosystem, globally as well, but definitely in this Indian ecosystem where there's about 197 million people with mental illness, right, in this country. And now we've got a crisis that's now exploding that need even further, right? So just take our very small example and try and contextualize it. Our uptake of our services and our products over the last 6 months has gone up by 3x. Right, and across the board, whether it's self-use products, whether we provide self-care programs, whether it's access to psychologists and therapists, whether it's the work we do with employers, it's all up by at least 3x in the last 6 months. Right, so that's the starting point. And what we are really seeing is that the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought at multiple levels, right? Whether it's interpersonal, whether it's financial, whether it's health anxieties and health uncertainty, is really contributing to some of this demand exploding in terms of people actually expressing their mental health needs more overtly. See, India has been very interesting for a long time in terms of how much of that population of need gets translated into actual demand, which is really around how many people will come and look for services and actually consume services in mental health. And that shift we're now seeing because there's a public discourse happening in India right now on mental health, which is getting more and more intense as they go along. But secondly, people have got to the point of saying, I don't care who finds out. I just need to get my problem solved. I'm just struggling here. And the second thing that's happened is that people who already had pre-existing illnesses haven't really had the same easy and seamless access to mental health services that they might have had pre-lockdown. So some of the and the context has also helped, not helped by exacerbating their symptoms, where somebody with schizophrenia who's been cooped up in a locked environment would just have had exacerbated symptoms. Somebody with depression similarly. So and they've not been able to access a psychiatrist or psychologist that easily in the last few months. So new cases because of the uncertainty and the context, and existing cases where the need has gone up as well, in a context where already there was a very high number and a huge treatment gap. 95% of people in India don't get access to mental health support that they need essentially. So so we're really seeing this demand shot up significantly.
And in fact, I want to jump in there because we've also seen quite a big rise in the number of suicides that we've seen across the board. Students, of course, but it's really across all ages and regions at this point, including a very high percentage of students. So Amit, what do you feel is driving people to that the most? Is it the sense of uncertainty? Is it financial worries because of job losses during this time? I mean, what's really the biggest and most painful issue right now?
So I always treat data this early with caution to see whether this is actually a trend or just anecdotal reporting, and that's being that's been seen as an exponential rise, largely because suicide in that age group 15 to 29 has been one of the leading causes of death in India for young people, right? So more young, it's number one or number two cause of death by suicide is number one and number two cause in that age group of people between 15 and 29. So that's already a huge population. Now what happens is, as we start talking about suicide publicly, and the way the reporting happens, some of it's glamorized, there's a bit of fetishization of suicide, all of those things, and there's very clear data around it, where things like copycat suicide, things like where it becomes a more accepted phenomenon, where are seen to be rising, and there are other things that are happening incidentally, where again, I don't know if that's a trend or whether there's just a blip in reporting, where things like there's some suicides of young people around PUBG, and there's anxiety around exams, and so it's hard to know what's driving it. Have the numbers actually gone up because the base is already very, very high, right? One thing I would point out though is that a lot of suicides are not linked to mental illness, at least in this country, right? So that's a big difference between the West, where I've practiced for about 15 years. So where there's a slightly higher correlation with mental illness in the Indian demographic, and there was an ICMR report recently which talked about this, that there's a lot of other causes of suicide which are not linked to mental illness directly, right? So there are sociological interventions, the societal discourse can have a huge impact on suicide rates in this country compared to the West sometimes, where there's a higher correlation between suicide and mental illness, relatively speaking, essentially.
Okay, so I'm going to get everyone in and then come back to some of these issues that I'd love to go into a little bit deeper as well. You mentioned the impact of gaming and the sudden ban on mental health, and I'm interested in exploring that. But let me really come to you, because there's naturally an impact on family relationships, constantly being around each other. What have you seen? Share with us first, really what some of the trends have been, or the kind of issues people have been dealing with right now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. It's a huge privilege and honor to be here today. And greetings from London, where it's a bright, sunny autumn day. And who would think that, there's so much COVID lurking around, because it's still very much prevalent out there. and lots of fear and anxiety. Amit, you talked about anxiety, and I think that that's sort of the keystone of what's impacting on family and couple relationships, because there are no existing templates for the kind of context that we're in at the moment, and so much uncertainty is kind of governing all of it. But what I thought I'd do is just start with a little case example that might illustrate some of the themes that we face in multi-generational families that are kind of key to all the families that I work with nowadays. So Mira and John, these are all fictional names. And in fact, it's not even just one case example. It's a composite case example that I've kind of cobbled together from 3 or 4 of the cases I've worked with, and I have their permission to use it. So Mira and John are an intercultural couple, which is one of the areas that I specialize in. She's from India, he's English. And they also live with with Mira's 78-year-old mother, who's visiting from Delhi. And the couple have 2 children, Amaya, 17, and Ben, 14. And they've been affected at all these different levels, all kinds of different levels through this pandemic. Mira's mother has been suffering because she has to shield. Mira as well is diabetic, and that means that she really hasn't been able to go out. They've been actually locked in the house now, the whole family, for about 5 or 6 months. And this is quite common. You know, there's a whole lot of stuff in the media here about the so-called BAME, Black and minority ethnic families and individuals who are highly at risk. And in fact, in some ways, I think it's kind of almost allowed and legitimized racism, because such people are seen as a threat and quite contaminating, but also they feel very vulnerable. So she is shielding, and the whole family is also shielding with her. Amaya, who is 17, is now finally going away to university, but has her A-level results. There was a big mess to do with the results and the public examinations. So she's really suffered from all the uncertainty about whether she's going to go or not, what her results were like, whether they were reflected her true performance and the hard work that she had put in. And again, this is true of all the families that I've worked with young people. And the 14-year-old boy, Ben, has been quite addicted to social media at this time. He's also really missing his friends, and it's been very difficult for the whole family to deal with his use of social media. And the couple have really fallen out. John, the husband, has found that he's very overwhelmed with responsibility, from taking on household, parenting responsibilities, as well as financial responsibilities, shielding his wife and his mother-in-law, not able to go to the house. We have Zoom sessions, and he'll often say, "You're the first person who smiled at me in a long time." So that's how isolated and quite depressed people can get. He's taken to misusing alcohol, and the couple get into lots of real arguments and fights, some of which end up in physical violence, which is really an expression of their difficulty in negotiating just these battles for space. How to create space in the midst of so much enforced togetherness is one of the themes that the couples and families I'm working with are bringing in very clearly. So I think that kind of highlights a lot of the themes. There's all the tensions of balancing virtual schooling with parents, working parents being at home and trying to find even just space. And of course, there's all the socioeconomic realities. I talked a little bit about the BAME communities, but class is a huge one. I mean, it's completely different for me to be in my home with a garden as compared to a multi-generational family in a small flat in a crowded area, in a city area. So these are some of the things that are really impacting on the families. But before I move on, I just want to say that in the midst of this, I'm really impressed by some of the resilience the couples and families have shown. I've met lots of families and couples who've really enjoyed this time together, who've grown as a result, who've been doing a few Zoom sessions, but report a lot of progress in their couple and family relationships. And there's been something quite lovely for them about having a much simpler lifestyle, about not having to commute, about having much less stress, about having to slow down and have a chance to really focus on what they find meaningful and significant and dear. So I just wanted to really end this little bit on that note.
No, it's always good to see the positive. But Reenee, the question I have for you, and which is coming to mind even more today, is while people are talking about things opening up, here in India in particular, there are still several cities that are seeing quite a heavy, it may not be an enforced lockdown, but more or less people are still kind of having to stay indoors. Companies globally are shifting to a permanent work from home environment, right? So now you could have the privilege to do up a space in your home which works as an office, but for many people, like you said, it's not a socioeconomic reality. So if this is a situation, while Trump's calling out for a vaccine by October or earlier, but realistically, we're probably not going to see a vaccine reach the millions of people that need it for the next couple of years. I don't want to depress anyone, but it's realistic. I mean, how does one cope? Because some of these anxieties, some of these issues are just going to be propagated during this time. Even if we just take a look at the next, let's say, 6 months, and we're being optimistic.
I completely agree. And I think it's really, really difficult for family relationships and couple relationships at any stage of the family life cycle. One of the things I think I forgot to mention is just that these rituals now have been stripped away. So rituals of marriage, rituals of funerals, I mean, they're now going ahead in more creative ways, and people have to adjust. We all have to adjust to this new normal, as it were. But even some of the things that we took for granted in terms of marking the transition from one family life cycle stage to another have gone. And similarly, as you talked about, very importantly, boundaries between work and home have completely broken down. So even the daily rituals that we had, whether it's, going into the office, however much we might grumble about a tube journey here in London, or, however each of you get to your workplace, there was some sense of a transition or ritual between work and home. And now those boundaries have broken down. So how do we deal with these changes? I've got a few tips which may or may not be helpful, which might even sound a bit trite in the face of what we're actually going through. But the whole thing about uncertainty, I guess it's a time to really embrace uncertainty and to give up control. And that might sound easier said than done, but this is what I'm trying to work with a lot of my clients towards, whether it's done through a spiritual route or a psychotherapeutic route. It really is something about understanding the limitations of what we can and cannot change and affect and control, and trying to take care of the bits that we can change. So it's a very sort of limited world, which could also feel safe at one level. It could also feel safe and certain if we make it safe and certain, or engage in practices that can create security and certainty. So almost a case, I would argue, for new rituals of some sort, which I also do with my own family and urge my clients to do, whether it's, putting in things in the diary, or it's Zoom calls where you gather together for people's birthdays online. It doesn't feel like the same, but, it can feel similar. And similarly at work, in our work, we have all kinds of rituals, whether it's sort of, debriefing sessions on Zoom, that will just help to sort of break up some of the uncertainty and the sort of gaps, long periods of time. And to go with that, with lots of the young people and the parents I work with, I try and get them to put in contracts, especially with the teenagers, contracts around the use of social media, contracts around household chores, especially given that everybody's at home nowadays, how to negotiate space apart and space together. I'll often urge families to create some spaces where they can be apart. And again, it's easier said than done. But for example, I was working with a couple where one of them, and they both have significant mental health issues, and one of them had to speak to his psychiatrist his therapist once a week and his psychiatrist once a month, and felt too embarrassed to do that in front of his partner. So I made a contract between the two of them so that the partner, the wife, could go out and go for a walk while the husband was having these conversations. So, it sounds so basic, but these sort of basic little things, where there's violence, and there has been, as you know, a huge incidence of domestic violence and intimate partner violence as a result of some of the tensions of living together in these enforced conditions and ways. And what I've suggested is that couples learn how to negotiate having a space apart. So when the arguments get heated, how can the partner who's likely to become violent talk about wanting even just to go for a walk? Sometimes they can't leave the house because they're shielding, as with the case I described earlier. Go into the garden, go into another room, take a few deep breaths, and then come back into the space they share together. But how to do that? So they have to negotiate this time out. Time out is very important in families who are living together all the time. but it has to be negotiated. So they might say, I'm now getting really quite upset and I'm leaving for 10 minutes or half an hour. But when I've calmed down, I'll come back and we can continue our conversation. Because if they don't do that, the family member who's left can be left feeling really abandoned and not know what to do with those feelings. And I've had situations where partners will be begging the one who's about to leave the room not to go. And then that in itself can create a situation where there is domestic violence. So I think one has to be very careful about how to keep people safe during this time. And there are all kinds of things the government is doing at this point to keep partners. But also in families, there's been a huge incidence of young people lashing out and hitting their parents and other elderly and vulnerable people, which is very hard to see. So it's really how to, and the other way around, parents hitting and getting very angry and upset with children. So there are a lot of cases of abuse and violence at this time, family violence. And so this has been a large part of my work, how to really help families to keep safe and to help them to come up with practical ways of negotiating separateness and togetherness in healthy ways. But I will keep quiet now. I think I've said too much already.
No, we'll come back to some of those tips. I think they're very important. And actually, we want some of everyone in the audience to really ask questions that you may have around this issue. It's an important issue. It affects everyone. So you can, send in your questions on the chat or even privately to any of us. And we'll take those and we'll address those. Amit, I saw you nodding, so I'm going to come back to you in a bit, but I want to bring Sue in at this point. And, Reenee also touched upon tools, Sue, with which you could perhaps try and soothe your anxiety or uncertainty and your fears at a time like this. You focus a lot on mindfulness, meditation, and I think that some of these tools have been incredibly helpful to people during the last few months. But tell us about the actual scientific correlation between spending time on this and how it does affect whether it's stress, whether it's your attention span, dealing with more Zoom calls, how it all really helps.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for inviting me here. It's a tremendous honor to be here. And I've already learned so much from Amit and Reenee and all of you. So it really is a wonderful pleasure on my part. So I'll talk a little bit about how stress, anxiety, depression, and psychosis may affect our brains and our brain networks and what we might be able to do to modulate that, specifically with mindfulness meditation. So neuroscientists have used neuroimaging to identify a brain network called the default mode network that is associated really with our inner mental lives. It's really activated mostly when we're not specifically attending to an attention demanding task. And it's mostly activated when we're daydreaming or mind wandering or engaged in what I call self-referential processing. So we may be reminiscing about the past or planning about the future. But you can imagine during these COVID times that we might be a little more depressed. So we might not be reminiscing so much. We might be perhaps obsessively ruminating, or we might not be planning about the future as much as maybe we're getting really anxious. We talked a lot about uncertainty. Maybe it's very anxiety provoking, stressful to not know what's going to happen in the future. And in this case, your default mode network, this brain network, is even more elevated. And it turns out that many patients who suffer from anxiety, depression, and psychosis have a significantly increased activation in this network. And the degree to which it's increased significantly correlates with an increase in rumination in the case of depression, as well as paranoid ideation and hallucinations in the case of psychosis. But luckily, our brain networks are plastic and they can be modulated with pharmacological interventions, but also through just experience and behavioral interventions, such as mindfulness meditation. And mindfulness meditation, we know, suppresses the default mode network because it allows us really to focus on what we're experiencing at the present moment rather than rehashing the past or obsessing about the future. So we did a recent 8-week intervention with children in the 6th grade in Boston schools, where they performed mindfulness meditation by focusing on their breathing for about 10 to 15 minutes every day. And what we found was a significant modulation in these brain networks that correlated with a significant reduction in self-perceived stress as well as negative feelings. It also correlated with an increase in sustained attention.
All right, so you definitely saw the impact of. Can I ask the kind of demographic or the trends you're seeing in terms of the people most hit?
So as we were discussing, actually, I think everybody's really hit with increased anxiety, the fear of the unknown, depression, everything's just exacerbated. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we may be able to do things like mindfulness meditation, which, by the way, many of us can download. I think Headspace is one app that I'm not associated with, in full disclosure, but there's other apps that you can download, including Inner Explorer, that's really targeted for children. And so even if you were to do this behavioral intervention, if you will, on your, just by practicing this mindfulness, guided mindfulness meditations for, just 10 minutes a day, it can have a significant impact on your experience during these really challenging times.
Okay. Amit, now I saw you nodding a couple of times. I'm not sure if you wanted to come in on something that we were already talking about, but I also wanted to ask you about the impact of the ban on PUBG here, and how that impacted students. And apparently there was a huge spike in sort of mental health issues and depression and anxiety because of the app being banned.
Sure. I mean, I was just going to go back to Reenee's point about developing new rituals and behaviors, right? And I think that's very critical in all contexts, right? We talked a bit about in the context of relationship, but also in the context of work, in the context of your health. I think it's important that we define some new rituals and then practice them and stick to them, because it's really hard. I mean, and we work with a large number of employers in India right now. We work with almost 90 employers and employing organizations in India right now. And what's really hard right now is this idea of the boundary dissipating, right? I was just sort of called to our accountant before, and he was telling me that he's really upset about the commute disappearing now, because that was his break, right? The commute was his break between work and then family life. That was his break time, and he's lost it completely, because now he's going to finish work at 7:30 instead of 5:30, and then he's going to be then back engulfed by family life. So I think so understanding how to delineate space for work, even, and I know space is luxury for a lot of us, especially people living in cities like London, Bombay, New York. So space is definitely a luxury. So how do you delineate space even in a one-bed apartment, and how do you define some area which could be very small, but that's your work area, and how do you dress for work every morning like you would normally go to work? How do you build time into your routine for not just physical but also psychological exercises? We just talked about mindfulness meditation, but even building 5-10 minutes on a daily basis into your routine will really help. How building a very strong ethic of physical exercise, especially right now, because if you think about it, all the activities disappeared, right? So even the act of walking to the tube station, which in my case used to be a 9-minute commute each way, so even that's disappeared now, right? So you're just sitting at home. So building some physical activity into your daily routine is very good. So some of those things, right? So physical exercise, mindfulness meditation, finding some geographic demarcation between space, workspace, and personal space, and finding some temporal demarcation, so between time for work and family time, and are all very critical. I think the other thing is around consumption of news, right? And how do you consume information? Because that can really trigger anxiety, especially if you're in India. And with no offense to the very esteemed news anchor on this chat, that's not the norm in India at all.
Don't do that kind of news, yeah.
But exactly, absolutely, right. So that's I was not the norm of a news anchor in India at all, and so the kind of news reporting that happens in India right now is bound to increase your anxiety. So consuming news in a time bound, in a time limited manner from reliable sources, and because actually it doesn't matter what the count is, case count or mortality count is day to day, it's not going to affect your life, right? What you need to do is follow the guidelines. So that's how do you consume news. That's the second thing that's very, very important, and restricting it to maybe 15 minutes a day from a reliable source. So that's the second thing we talk about. Third thing that Reenee touched on is really how do you connect with people, right? So and special occasions, absolutely, right. But also on I have a ritual now where on a Saturday night I connect with my college friends. We speak every Saturday night, and we hadn't spoken for a decade before that. So we speak every Saturday night now, right? So and there's half an hour, 45 minutes, four of us get on a WhatsApp call, do a video call every Saturday night, right? So what's your ritual, right? And what therapists also recommending people do is that they connect and have one meaningful conversation every day with somebody for even 15-20 minutes, right? So not just connecting and saying, hi, how are you doing? But having a meaningful conversation with somebody for at least 15-20 minutes every day is really going to help build this connection. The last two things we're recommending to people strongly are having worry time put aside. So maybe demarcating about 30 minutes or 20 minutes in a day where you'll bucket all your anxieties and spend that time just worrying about things and creating an action list out of that. And secondly, having a gratitude journal, right? So where you actually think of the 2 or 3 things that went well in the day. So, and this is a bouquet of strategies. Some things are going to work for somebody and some for others, and then not everybody's going to do everything. But if you pick out those things, having a physical, psychological ritual, having the market time for gratitude and worry, and then how do you socially connect in these 3 buckets, and take one from each and implement that in your life, that could really help on the condition. The second thing I wanted to touch on was Susan was talking about in terms of mindfulness, right? And right now, what we are seeing, at least with our therapists, so we have a network of over 100 therapists that we work with in India, and what we're really seeing is that a lot of our therapists have gone and really started focusing on mindfulness as a strategy for people especially people with low grade anxiety that's become very pervasive in terms of their functioning, right? So there, and Susan's talking about people with very severe mental illness also benefiting from it, and I'm sure that's absolutely true. But what we've seen is seeing a lot of benefit for people in terms of relationship context, work context, and the health context is really helping people get through their day, and that's a really real anchor for people from that perspective. So I absolutely agree. I think your last question about PUBG, I'm really not an expert on young people, frankly. I'll put that disclaimer out there. But what's really been happening is that these things just seem to be taking a life of their own, right?
Yeah.
So and it was in the Indian context at least, was Blue Whale a couple of years ago, and so the thing to recognize is that young people, especially younger people, so in the demarcation, people who are in their early teens or just before preteens are really susceptible to influences, right? And so, especially when we talk about preteens, it's very, very important that parents know what their children are watching, what they're doing on social media, and how they're interacting with others through digital mediums, and really monitor that, right? I know it's a difficult conversation for some parents, but it's really critical that gets monitored, especially right now, right? Because right now it's even harder to monitor because there's so much digital access, right? My son used to be limited to 30 minutes of device time on a weekend, 2 days of the weekend, so 1 hour in a week, is now spending 6 to 7 hours in a day on a device, right? Because all classes are happening there, everything's happening there. So even, now it's even more critical that we are actually monitoring what's happening. It's possible that those bans have really caused that level of distress because some of the younger people had become at least emotionally sort of dependent on those interactions. But it's also possible that these things from a sociological perspective, where people are seeing how other people might have reacted to it, then take a life of their own, right? And then the reporting doesn't help. So I think it might be both, but on that last part, I'm really not an expert. That's just my conjecture, essentially.
No, it's interesting to address the trend because, like you're saying, it's also the fact that these things are happening and forming a life of their own that's just taking everyone else a little by surprise. No one knows how to deal with these situations. Everyone's trying to figure it out as they go. Reenee, I want to bring you in on that because, parents are battling with schooling from home, screen time, not being allowed to send their kids outdoors, not having the space on their own, especially if the kids are younger, dealing with anxiety about college, and fees. I mean, it's a multi-layered effect here.
It is, yes. I mean, I completely agree with some of the things that Amit was saying. I'm struck by the young people, the number of young people who are coming in with the thoughts of self-harm. We've really had an upsurge of that, as well as alcohol and drug-related difficulties in young people. Not so much the children. The children have been presenting very interestingly with some of them who had separation anxiety from their parents and found it quite hard to function, have actually been much healthier during this time because they don't have to leave the house and they're sort of with their parents 24/7. So that's actually worked quite well for some families. And homeschooling as well has worked quite well, I have to say, for some children, especially those who have special needs. So any kind of autistic spectrum disorder or anything to do with any kind of learning difficulties, they've actually benefited from being online, as well as not having distractions from their social group or peer group, and those who really couldn't socialize. So it's been quite a mixed picture. But I do think that the self-harm is quite pronounced. And again, it's not so much linked with depression, but some of it is quite impulsive. And some of it seems to be impacted on by social media. So again, and eating disorders as well. It's almost as if any kind of pathology, psychopathology that there was present before has become exacerbated. And that goes for every generation, for the parents, but as well as for the children and young people. So that's what is really difficult. And if you're thinking about a family where there's multiple people who have psychological difficulties, and you think about the interactions between all these different people, that's also been very tough. But I don't think I'm saying very much in terms of what one can do, except really.
You wanted to share some practical ideas as well, at least the situations where perhaps one has thought through of options on how to.
I mean, certainly with the couples and families where there has been violence, I have been trying to put into effect some of the things that we've talked about, and certainly, the ideas about mindfulness and how people can learn how to soothe themselves, and also to recognize signs and symptoms of arousal within themselves. How the partners, and again, not to generalize, but often they are the male partners, not always, but often, how they can recognize situations where they are getting hyper aroused and think about what's happening in their bodies. So really coach them to think about these fight-flight responses and what is going on. And sometimes even a simple intervention like sitting on a chair and just sort of tapping your feet, because especially when there isn't much space, can help, because your body, your brain will believe that you are running away. So there's some flight response. So something active. In some families, they're lucky enough to have some gym equipment. So even just going there to work out for a few minutes, anything, to sort of work through the stress levels is very helpful, or to soothe oneself through some meditation and some exercises. And then what I talked about in terms of time out. But I think certainly for parents to be mindful of what the children are watching on social media, to use this time as an opportunity to teach their children some life skills, because this time is not going to come back. Certainly my own family, I've been trying to teach my 15-year-old how to cook. I think it's about time. But and to learn actually that food doesn't just arrive at the flick of a button called Deliveroo. There's a lot of effort to produce it. So it's actually, again, to come back to a more positive spin, some of these things are opportunities for us just to revise our ways of living in a world that had become increasingly stressed. I've had families where both parents travel all the time, and the children are left being brought up by nannies, being brought up by tutors, being brought up by the internet. And this really, I think, affords all of us a chance to really look at our own parenting, to think about how we parent, to make some important shifts and changes, but to do this in conversation with our children and young people. What do they want? Would they want their parents to go out for a walk with them, or to watch a film with them sometimes, or even just for the whole family to cook together? So can we involve our children and teach our clients to do the same? I also just wanted to say a little bit about the opportunities for therapy and teaching. And I know that there'll be lots of students hopefully watching today. And just that this whole new world has also revolutionized the way in which we can teach and do therapy. I mean, imagine the possibility of coming together in a panel and forum like this from all over the world. And so there are some really, really positive things. I prefer working with people in the room rather than working remotely. And at the same time, it means that all the remote families whom I've never had a chance to reach out to can actually now be seen and helped. So there are some amazing things about this new normal as well. And as therapists and mental health professionals, as teachers, we have to particularly take good care of ourselves. So rituals like regular supervision, I now have weekly supervision. From monthly, it's gone to weekly. And I really value that space where I can just share some of these impossible situations that I'm dealing with online, and that too online, which makes it that much more difficult. I have also started working in the room, but very carefully at a social distance. So sometimes as therapists and mental health professionals, we have to gauge what's the best fit for our clients. There's some situations that are so unsafe that actually working remotely is not enough. So, we have to take the precautions and actually work with people in the room. So just a few other practical things about how to work.
Okay, great. We have a question coming in. Amit, maybe you want to take it, or any of you or all of you. Ria's asking, have anxiety disorders in people been spiking post the lockdown periods, or are people more aware now in general? I think she's also referring to the specific timelines, because there was an initial spike when we had the initial lockdown, after which actually we've actually seen a more dramatic spike. But her question is, what trend you're witnessing in some of those anxiety disorders.
I can crack on with that, and then hopefully somebody with a better academic mind like Susan might want to input on that. And I so it's very hard to tell, right? So what we've seen is a consistent rise, right? So since March, if you look at our graph of usage, it's been rising consistently. It's not shown any sort of dips and spikes at all. It's been rising consistently, right? And the conversations that our therapists are reporting really are around a lot of them around anxiety, right? And anxieties around the lockdown itself, but also health anxieties, financial anxieties. And those have continued beyond the financial lockdown. So see, the initial upsurge, at least the clientele we are seeing, was really around what is it going to mean for my job, or how do I stay healthy. We were also working with frontline healthcare workers at the time, so some of the anxiety, but will I infect my family? All those things really sort of started coming. Or my kids are abroad, and how am I going to get them back? And so a lot of these things started playing out very early. But having said that, I think the context around still not being able to fully go out is not helped, and that's just what people have to do to keep safe right now. I think the second group, which is really saying, are people more aware? They probably are. I mean, the conversation and the discourse in the media right now is so intense. It's impossible not to be aware right now, right? You can't open a newspaper today without reading about a mental health, an article on mental health of some sort or the other, right? You definitely can't open switch on a TV channel and hear about a suicide case, and not hear about a suicide case. So definitely the discourse is a lot more intense. So which also then propagates the awareness. But I do think that a lot of it is just the impact of the pandemic. I was talking to Professor Shekhar Saxena. He's a faculty at the public school, public health school at Harvard, and he was really talking about how from previous pandemics, the WHO's experience was that you can almost get a 4 to 5 times spike in the need for mental health support. Right? And we actually don't know what the impact of this is yet, right? Because what we are trying to solve for what's in front of us right now, right? And if I go back to sort of my early clinical experience back in the UK, in 2001, I was still seeing patients from the first Gulf War, and the impact of it from PTSD perspective or anxiety perspective 12, 13 years later, right? So we just don't know how this is going to play out in the medium and the long term. Right now, what we're seeing is the immediate impact of it on somebody's mind, but how this plays out medium to long term, how it plays out with younger people as they develop right now, we have no idea. So, talking to this prof, he was suggesting a 4 to 5 times rise in mental health needs in a pandemic, essentially. And he was referring to Ebola and SARS and other things that looked at WHO when he was there, and that's what he was referencing essentially.
Okay. I mean, Reenee, I'll let you add to that, but there's also a couple of questions that have come in from Shebna Matthew and Nishakyani Sivara as well on virtual therapy sessions and whether they're now being a lot more accepted naturally. One part of it is that of course everyone has to go in for virtual, but on the other hand, is it being seen as having advantages over in-person therapy? Accessibility perhaps, other advantages or disadvantages?
Yes. I think it's a very, very good question. And actually, some early research has shown that actually lots of families prefer virtual therapy. So sometimes as therapists, we may not prefer it. And that the therapeutic alliance is seen to be exactly the same in virtual as in in-room therapy. So clients are finding it absolutely fine to connect. They're also in the convenience of their own homes. Sometimes for us, it gives us a very different glimpse of them because we see them in their natural context. So there's a lot of positives as well for virtual therapies. Some of the negatives that I've found and other researchers have found is that you don't, especially if you're working with couples and families, with individuals it's a bit different, but with couples and families you don't get such a clear sense of the interactions, you don't get a sense of the body language, you only see a small segment of a person, and so the therapy has been much more linguistic than than relying on the feelings that you pick up if you were actually working in the room. But having said that, on balance, I think it's an amazing change, and to be able to offer this, and lots of families and couples are doing very well with virtual therapy.
Okay, so I have a question for you on whether brain imaging could serve individuals who suffer from mental illness or children who might be at risk for developing mental illness.
Sure, thank you so much. I just wanted to comment also, Renee's point is that we've also done some virtual mindfulness meditation. When we initially were, typically when you're doing mindfulness meditation, you don't have any visual feedback as to how you're doing necessarily. So we've been using real-time fMRI neurofeedback to have patients with schizophrenia or anxiety and depression. We have them in the magnet and we train them to do mindfulness meditation in the magnet, and we feed back the level of brain activation in regions, say within the default mode network or central executive, and then they play a ball game in the magnet, and the ball goes up when the central executive is higher than the default mode. And so anyway, they push down their default mode network by doing mindfulness, and they push up their central executive by doing mindfulness, and they play this ball game. They're able to get it up into the circle, which is the goal of the task. And that's been really rewarding for the patients. But after COVID set in, we were no longer able to get the patients into the scanner. So what we've done is since they've already learned how to do mindfulness meditation, augmented with this real-time fMRI neurofeedback, we now provide Zoom sessions for the patients with schizophrenia. And we've to do mindfulness meditation with a postdoc of mine. We've opened that up to anybody around the world to come in and into the Zoom sessions, and people can do it together. So it's a very different experience than perhaps downloading an app or doing it by yourself, but it's just another alternative that COVID has brought about, different kind of opportunity. So I just wanted to mention that.
Well, there's been a lot that, sorry, go on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, sorry.
No. Were you saying something, Sue?
No.
No, I was saying there's a lot actually that one could take away from the conversation we've had with all of you today. You've touched upon so many different facets, from mindfulness meditation to physical activity, how to build it into your day, even if it's restricted, to creating a certain routine, even with small actions, finding space with your family, a lot of very important things that you've addressed in today's chat. Just as we wind up, and since Reenee took the lead in really building some positivity into this conversation, and I think that's where it all begins from. We all have to find a way to look ahead with optimism. Amit, in your closing comments, anything you'd like to leave us with?
I think so for us as an organization and as professionals within the organization, the one huge positive has been the number of people who are now more open to coming out and seeking support for their mental health. Right. So and specifically talking about India, and I think I'm very optimistic and hopeful that trend will continue, and more people will access help, and we will be able to dent the treatment gap. The other thing I'd say is you can only control what you can control, and the rest of it you can't control. And by definition, I know that sounds very simplistic to say, but by definition, trying to control what you can't control is just going to lead to more anxiety. Right? So step back, have a look at what you can control, and just focus on the controllables, and then and write them down. I am a big fan of writing stuff down. If you look around my desk, there are all these piles of papers of things I've written down, either about myself or about work, or about myself or about the family. And so write things down. Don't keep them in your head. The more stuff that stays in your head, the less space you have to heal, the less space you have to think through in a more relaxed manner about life. So write things down, bring them out on paper, and know that you can only control what you can control.
And don't watch the news.
Don't watch the news, please. Please don't watch the news.
Okay. Reenee, there is one other question that's come in saying mental disorders affecting teenagers, peer pressure, school pressure, how has it changed vis-a-vis pre-COVID? We do have, of course, several students watching as well. So has there been a shift to perhaps the nature of mental health issues?
Yes. And I think that more research obviously is needed. And as Amit was saying, there are lots of effects of things that we don't even know about just right yet, but they'll emerge in the years to come. But from what I can see in the young people that I work with, Before that, the pressure was more about social gatherings, a lot of it, especially for teenagers, and parties and behavior, whether it's the consumption of alcohol and drugs at parties, especially here in the UK. I find that changing now to a lot of online behaviors and gaming behaviors and influences online. So it's almost as if our whole worlds have shifted online, and including our children's and teenagers' worlds have shifted online. And this, I think, as Amit was talking about, can be quite a dangerous thing, because if you're worried about peer pressures face to face, then there's a way in which, especially in our generation, we have our own ways of monitoring them, because we don't know as much about the internet as our children and young people do. Certainly speaking for myself as a dinosaur, it's just a completely different thing. You don't have that much of a sense of control over it at all. So yes, I think it's quite a worrying trend that the pressures have all moved online, really. But
so
there's one. So go on.
No, interestingly, I think in line with that, we have another question coming in from Kabir Marwa, and he's saying that, do you feel that mental health and augmented reality can combine and find a solution towards helping people on a larger scale, especially since the cost of current online sessions can also be intimidating?
Absolutely, and Amit might be a better person to speak to that, but I think the kinds of opportunities we now have for apps, and I've been thinking a lot about a sort of couple and family app in the time of COVID, and how some of the things that we've been talking about, how one could actually help families to do some pretty basic things online together, whether it's making contracts or creating family rituals, or finding a way to connect, finding a way to take time apart, etc., etc. Many of the practical things that we've been talking about. So yes, I think that mental health and technologies can have a very they can be a very useful interface nowadays.
I was just going to add to that AR is really now, this AR and VR both are really now playing a big part. There's a very strong group coming out of Oxford, the company called Oxford VR. Younger people, there's a product called Limbix that's really playing out in terms of working with AR and VR for younger people, for adults, especially with now there's
You're frozen. We can't
Yeah,
hear
I
you.
think we lost him. Amit, just wait for a second. Yeah, you'll come back, and then now go ahead.
Great, sorry. So I was just saying that so they really built strong, standardized, sort of validated programs for psychological conditions, and I think this is, and they published in very reputable journals around the outcomes. That book will just grow, right? So there's a lot of work happening in the AR/VR space right now. I think given the paucity of mental health professionals globally, as the cost of those deliverables come down and standardization and more cultural-specific programs get used for the developing world, at least, where there's a huge shortage of professionals, essentially.
Okay, interesting. Sue, anything you'd like to end with?
That was terrific. No.
Okay, all right. So on that note, I think I'll hand it back. Thank you all for sparing some time to join us with some of those wonderful tips today. I think it was an incredibly useful conversation. Vidhi, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, our audience. We hope you had some great takeaways. I know I personally did. On behalf of our leadership team, Pranav, Chirag, and myself, I would like to thank all of our panelists, Reenee, Amit, Abha, and Sue, for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. We are very, very appreciative of your time. Samir, for being one of our most active members and being so thoroughly engaged in the community and bringing together the panel today. Bob, thank you so much for joining us from Boston and providing critical updates on campus life for our students and their families. Also, Yelena, thank you so very much for helping us bring the event together. I definitely also want to thank Pranav and Chirag for coordinating and putting their time towards this event. So for all of our audience, please be sure to join the Northeastern University Mumbai Community Group. We have a group on Facebook, and you can also subscribe to this channel by hitting the subscribe button down below. If you would like to connect with us, the community leaders, you can just leave a comment on this video and we will pick it up from there. We will get in touch with you, or you can also leave a comment on our Facebook page and we will connect with you from there. So we will be back with another program very soon. Thank you again to everybody, and we wish you a good night. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you.
You too, Reenee. Thank you.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, guys.